Appwrite Authentication allows you to easily create users. However, these users are not created in the Appwrite database. Sometimes you may want to create a user in the database so that you can use relationships between tables to reference that user. In this video, I will show you how to do that.
For this tutorial, we are going to need a couple of things. First of all, we are going to use the Appwrite Console to create our user, so we are not going to write any authentication code, as this tutorial assumes you already have your own code written. Secondly, we are going to create an Appwrite function which will be triggered by Authentication Events. We are going to write some code in the function that will create the user in the database. So with no further ado, let's get started. So on the left-hand sidebar, you will see the Functions button. So click on Functions and then go on the right-hand side here, click on the Create Function button, then choose All Starter Templates, then click Create Function again, and let's name our function Create-User. For our runtime, we are going to select Bun 1.1 because it supports TypeScript right out of the box, and we don't have to compile any JavaScript we don't have to compile any TypeScript code into JavaScript. Click Next, and then we'll arrive at the permissions page. We will keep the permissions just as they are for now, but we are going to change them later in the code so that we are able to interact with the database and update our collections as well to insert data. Now click Next, and for the deployment section, make sure to choose Connect Later because we are not going to do any Git integration. And once you click the Create button, this will create the base function based off of the template. So now the next step is to pull the functions code into your Codebase. If you haven't initialized your Appwrite project yet, what you can do is you can go to your terminal and type Appwrite init project, and you will be asked to choose which project you want to initiate. Since I have already set it up, I'm just going to type N here and cancel the initiation. And instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to type Appwrite pull function. Now it's going to ask me which functions would you like to pull. I've created some other functions from previous tutorials. However, the function that we care about is called create user. So I'm going to press on the spacebar to select it, and I'm going to press enter. It's going to ask me, do I want to pull the source code of the latest deployment? And I'm going to type Y to confirm that yes, I do indeed want to do that. And then on the left hand side of my IDE, I can see functions, create user, source, and I can see the main.ts file. If I open the main.ts file, you can see some boilerplate right here, which is what this particular starter function comes with. TypeScript right. So the next step is to install the dependencies, because as you can see, our IDE is complaining about unrecognized imports, and also Bun is not working because we can't find where the type definitions are. So in order to install the dependencies, we are just going to cd into the functions /create-user. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to type npm I for npm install, and it should install the dependencies. Now, although we install the dependencies, as I've mentioned, you're going to see that Bun is still complaining that we can't find the type definitions. All we have to do is just install those type definitions by running this command right over here. I'm going to paste it, types/bun, and that should install the type definitions for Bun, and it should be able to now resolve the class. Now, before we write any code, we have to go back to the Appwrite Console and we have to create a database and a table so that we can store our users inside and have some sort of schema that will be applicable to users. So to do that, let's go to the left-hand side to Databases, and then on the right side, click the plus Create Database button, and we can choose any name for our database. We can call it Test, and I'm going to click Create, and that creates our database. Now, collections is the same principle, and it's the same thing as tables. So a table can be, in this case, called users. So I'm going to press Create Collection. I'm going to type the collection name users, and I'm going to click Create. Now that we've created the users table, we also have to define what kind of schema this particular table will have. And this is what the attribute section is here for. So I'm going to go to create an attribute, and I'm going to click on string, and I'm going to add a new attribute key that we can probably call something like name. And the size of the name is going to be 64 characters. That's the maximum size. And we can make it optional. So I'm going to press create now, and that will create an attribute. Now, the reason why you don't need an ID attribute is because you can use the document's ID, and you can set whatever the document's ID is to match with whatever the user ID is from the authentication system. And we are going to look into it in a second. Now, before we finish, it is very important to know that we have these IDs that represent the tables and the databases. So it's important to have those IDs. Obviously, the ones that I have right here are not going to be working. So you have to keep a note of your own IDs, and we are going to add them later into our code base. Another important concept that you have to familiarize yourself with it is called the events. Events is a way of interacting with your solutions based on some specific triggers. So, for example, if a user is created, we want to send an event for a function to be triggered in order to insert that user into the database. There are several event categories that are currently supported, for example, authentication, databases, storage, functions, and messaging. However, the particular one that we are very interested in, and is the scope of our tutorial today, is the authentication. And authentication has a lot of different events, as you can see. However, the one that we are going to focus ourselves onto in this tutorial is the user's create event, because this event triggers when a user is created, and we need to use that trigger to call our serverless function, which will then insert that user into our database. Now, the way to make sure the function is triggered based on this particular event is to actually go to the Appwrite Console and head to Functions, then choose your function, the create user that we've just created in this tutorial, and then click on Settings, then scroll down to almost the bottom right about here where it says Events, then click on the Add an Event button, and you will see that it asks you to choose a service that will trigger this particular function. So in this case, we want to choose users, and we also want to choose an action, which is the create. And as you can see, it's users.*.create, which is the same kind of event that was described right over here. So let's go back to the function and add this particular trigger by pressing the create button. Make sure to press the update button for the changes to take effect. Now, the next step is to head back to the code base, and as you can see, the Appwrite.json file does not have the events updated yet. So in order to update the events so that the Appwrite.json file reflects the state of what the function has in the cloud, you have to go to the terminal and type Appwrite pull function. Then you have to choose the function, so in this case is create user, press space to select it, and then enter, and you will be asked if you want to pull the source code of the latest deployment. In this case, we are going to decline, we're going to press N, and we are going to get the Appwrite.json file updated. So if we head back to the file, we see that the events for this particular function is now up to date with users.*.create available here. Well, now it's time to start writing some code. Let's open the main.ts file. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of boilerplate in this place. So there's a lot of code here that we don't need. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete whatever we are returning. I'm going to explain to you a couple of things. We do need to initiate a client using the node Appwrite library. The reason why we need to initiate the client is because we can consume it as a parameter for any class related to Appwrite functionality. So for example, here we have a users variable that initiates an instance of users class, and we pass in the client as a parameter. That means whenever we type users dot, we can do quite a bit of actions with it. For example, creating a user. Instead of users, what we actually need is databases. So we're going to type const databases, and we're going to instantiate databases from node Appwrite, and we're going to pass in the client as a parameter. The client itself has a few things. It has the API endpoint, which is consumed from the environment variable. It has the project ID, which is also consumed from the function itself in the environment variables that have been predefined. And it also has an Appwrite key, but we don't actually need to update any of these things that already exist. The only thing we need actually is the database ID and the collection ID that I've mentioned previously. So if we head back to Appwrite Console and we go to the databases, we can copy the database ID from here, and we're going back to the Codebase, and we can create a new .env file. And inside this .env file, we can include the database underscore ID, and we can pass the ID here. And likewise, we also need the collection ID. So if we go back to the Appwrite Console, we press on the database. Now we are going to copy the collection ID for the users, go back to the env file, and we can type collection underscore ID and pass the value here. Now, moving back to the actual function, one thing that we have to understand is that once a user is created in the authentication system, a payload will be sent as part of the event trigger to the function. So that means we have to be able to access that particular payload from within the main.ts file. So the question is, how do we do it? The answer is quite straightforward, however, we have to take an extra step. So the payload is going to be made available as part of the rec object, and you can access it through the attribute body JSON. But how do we know that? Well, it's actually documented as part of the Appwrite documentation online, but there's a better way on how we can make sure this becomes a type-safe way to be able to reference that. So just right above the export default, I'm going to define an interface that I'm going to call the request body. Now that interface will extend the user model because that is what the payload is about. And we are also going to add a couple more attributes to that. Now, in order to extend the user model, it's not something that Node Appwrite has available right off the bat. What we need to do is go to the terminal and type npm i Appwrite. Now, this is going to install the client-side version of Appwrite, but that particular version does include the model that we are looking for. So if we go back here and I type models, I'm going to import it from the Appwrite and not Node Appwrite. So inside models, I can reference the user, and I can also create a generic that's going to apply to models preferences. So this particular interface will now contain a type-safe definition of what the request body is expected to be when the event is triggered. However, there's a couple of things that are missing from this particular interface, and one of them is targets. And this can be referenced as models.target, which is an array of targets. And we can also get some information such as accessed at to be string. So now we do have a request body, and whenever we create constant and expect the request body to be of a particular type, what we can actually write here is const data is request.bodyJSON, but the body JSON itself is not of type any, but it is of type request body. And now if we type data dots, we can reference the payload in a type safe way. Now that we have the request body, we can start interacting with the database. First of all, we're going to have to check if the user already exists in the database. And the way we're going to do that is by typing const user, and we're going to reference the database. We're going to type await databases dot get document. And so the get document, we need to pass a few parameters, a few arguments. So the database ID, the collection ID, and the document ID. So as I mentioned previously, we have now saved those environment variables that refer to the database ID and the collection ID. So that means we can also reference them by using bun. And the way to do that is just like the example right over here. So what I'm going to write is bun.env, and I'm going to reference the database ID. And of course, the next part is also that we need to reference the collection. So that would be the collection ID. And we also need to pass the document ID. Now, as I've mentioned previously, the document ID is going to be the user ID so that we can easily cross-reference these two things. So I can just type data.$ID, and that should now contain the user ID. One thing about Appwrite's classes is that they do throw exceptions if they don't find the value that you're looking for or something else goes wrong. So we're going to have to create a try-catch block around the const user. So I'm going to create a try-catch block right over here. And I'm going to put the user inside the user constant that we just declared. And I'm also going to check if user, then what we need to do is simply return back the function and say that the user already exists. So we can do that by typing return res.json, and we can have a message that says user already exists. Whereas in the catch block, we know for a fact that the user does not exist, but we don't want to throw an error because we want to move on to the next step where we are going to create the user in the database. So I can just type log user does not exist in database, proceed with creating the user in database. So this will give us some internal logs for the function. Now that we know that the user doesn't exist in our database, the next step is to actually create the user in our database. We're going to create another try-catch block just like we did previously. And in this case, we're just going to attempt to insert an entry into the database by typing await databases.create document. In this case, create document takes 4 mandatory arguments. So one is the database ID, the collection ID, the document ID, and finally the data object. Now we know from the previous usage that we can use the database and collection ID that we can fetch from the environment variables. So I'm going to copy and paste this right over here. And we also know for a fact that we want to use the user ID as our document ID as well. And finally, we can pass a data object, which in this case is going to contain the name of the user. So I can type name, and the name of the user is going to be fetched from the data object. And we can definitely return a message here. We can say res.json message user created successfully. We can also log this out into our internal logging. So make sure to use log and not console log. And we can say user created successfully as well. In the catch block, we might also want to catch any errors. Print out an error message that's going to say fail to create user in the database, or actually the user in the database. Return a JSON object response that can say the same exact message. So now before we deploy this code base onto the Cloud Function, we need to make one more change in the function itself. We have introduced the environment variables locally, however, they are not available on the Cloud Function remotely. So what we're going to do is we are going back to the actual functions. I'm going to click Functions, Create User, and then I'm going to go to Settings. I'm going to scroll down where it says Environment Variables. So it should be right about here, Environment Variables. And what I'm going to do is click on the plus button here to insert the variables I want to use. In our case, it's going to be the database ID and the collection ID. So I'm going to type database ID here, and I'm going to pick the value from my .env file. I'm going to paste it and press on create. And I'm going to repeat the process for the collection ID as well. I'm going to click on the create variable button. I'm going to type collection_ID. And I'm going to copy the collection ID that I want to refer to. And I'm going to paste the value here and then press on the create button. So now my collection ID and the database ID environment variables are made available into the Cloud Function, and we can proceed with deploying the code base to the cloud. So to do that, let's head over to the terminal and let's type Appwrite push function. And we're going to select create user. I'm going to press space to select it and then enter to proceed. And now it's pushing to the cloud. Cool. So now let's head back to the functions. And at the beginning of this tutorial, I mentioned that we are going to need to update some permissions. So because we are interacting with the database and we are creating documents, we need to have appropriate permissions for this function to be able to access the database. So in order to do that, we have to go down to the scope section and we have to choose database here. and we have to enable a few scopes, a few permissions. One of them is collections read and databases read, whereas the other one is documents read. And of course, we need to be able to insert the documents, so we need to have documents write permissions. So I'm going to update these permissions by clicking the update button here. And once it's been updated, I'm going to head back to the terminal and I'm going to type Appwrite Cloud Function. And I'm going to choose create user. I'm going to press N. And if we go to the appwrite.json file, we'll now see that the scopes have been updated here. Now that the scopes have been updated, we can proceed with testing the function by creating a user. And now finally, we can test the entire setup. The way to do it is by going back to the Appwrite Console, and we're going to head over to the Auth section. And we're going to create a user here. I'm going to press create user. I'm going to add my name, my business email right over here, and just a randomly generated password, and I'm going to press on the create button. Now, as you can see, the user has been created in the authentication section. We can now go ahead in the databases. We can click on the database and choose the users, and we can see that the user we just created in the authentication mechanism is now available within the users collection. So this is pretty much all for this tutorial. Thank you very much for watching. I know it's been quite a long tutorial. If you found it very useful, then please make sure to leave your comments and tell me how this tutorial has been. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.